As sprint races go, this was a good one, partly because it was wet. They all started on intermediates, well, virtually all of them. Valtteri Bottas came in for intermediates after one lap on mediums on the exploratory lap. And then later in the race, as the track started to dry on the groove, a couple of the key runners came in for slicks, but none of the front runners. The front runner, the race at the front, was all in intermediates. Anyway, let's get down to it, because Max Verstappen's on the pole. Alongside him is Sergio Perez, his teammate, his frustrated teammate, you got to say, because he messed up qualifying yesterday. He hasn't had a good run since he won in Baku. After Baku, he was talking about, I can take the championship to Max. There's a lot of pressure on him from Mexico. There's a lot of stuff going on. And then there was Brazil last year as well. So what Max didn't need, particularly in the wet, was Sergio Perez making a good start and having to pass him. But that's exactly what happened. This was a sprint race. You could say Max is on the pole for the Grand Prix tomorrow, so there was no reason to get really stuck into it. But this is Max Verstappen. He is a race driver. So Sergio Perez, they both started in second gear to minimize wheel spin. So Sergio Perez actually got a better run down the inside into turn one than Max. So Max let him go out of one. But as a result of that, Perez ran a little bit wide out of one, up onto the curbs. Max made a perfect exit, I guess predicting what Perez was going to do, and was in a perfect position to go down the inside under braking for turn three. But as they approached turn two, which is basically a flat-out kink, it does have this name turn, but it's not really a turn. It's only a turn in the sense that the track changes direction a little bit. It is flat out, even in the wet. As they approached there, Max was right up alongside Sergio, and Sergio did what he was always going to do, in my opinion, drove him off the road onto the grass. Not completely. Max was able to put two wheels on the grass and then come back in. But you could tell at that moment that the adrenaline was well and truly up. And going into three, Max was on the inside. He braked really late, ran wide, which is what he was going to do anyway, because that's where the grip was at turn three. But he had to brake really hard mid-corner, as a result of which Perez had to brake hard. And there was a bit of a skirmish. Fernando Alonso ran a little bit wide as well. And all that lets Nico Hulkenberg into P2, which is a pretty good result for Max, actually. But going back to that incident, no doubt in my mind that Perez kind of knew what he was doing. He said afterwards, after the race, visibility was terrible. I didn't know Max was there. As soon as Max was there, I gave him room. Yeah, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? Where else did he think Max was going to be? He knew that he had bobbled coming out of turn one. He knew that Max had made a clean exit, absolutely for sure. What's Max going to go down to the left, approaching a right-hander? I don't think so, especially there's a little bit of room. So for sure, even if Perez didn't know he was there, he could have assumed he was there and not moved over just in case he was there. This is his teammate after all. Sorry, what was that I said? Teammate? Yeah, right. So put all that into the perspective of how it's been going for Perez since Baku. Put that in the perspective of Perez saying after Baku, I can take the championship to Max, assuming I get equal cars, equal equipment. And putting it into the context as well of what happened in Brazil last year, no surprise at all that Perez forced the issue, particularly after a very, very bad qualifying yesterday. He needed to show what he could do, and if he could win the sprint race, great. He was going to do it. Now, the question is, and you'll probably think this is being a bit too contrived, but the question in my mind is why Max didn't anticipate any of that. Why Helmut Marko, who I guess is the guy he listens to most, maybe his dad, didn't say to him and hasn't said to him on a regular basis, don't trust Perez. You may get on with him face-to-face. It may be okay in debriefs. It may even be okay in front of the TV cameras. But do not trust him in racing situations because of everything that's happened, because of the way for sure he's feeling. I doubt anybody has been saying that because Max didn't anticipate what Perez was going to do. I think Perez was completely wrong in what he did, but I think Max should have anticipated that he was going to do something like that. You get my point. Equally, we know that Red Bull have a very, very bad record of controlling their drivers. Go back to the Vettel days, of course. And that all ended in tears a couple of times. So there's no way Christian Horner saying to them, race hard, but don't touch one another. There's no way that means anything, because what is racing hard other than occasionally shutting the gate? And that's what we saw today. So it was good racing, you could say, and it'll be talked about, and it'll probably be rerun a lot, and Max Verstappen won't be happy, and Perez now knows that he's probably awakened the sleeping giant in the sense of Max ever giving Perez any room anywhere ever again. And they may well talk politely about one another afterwards. They might say the right things for the media, but that is the situation. And I don't think Red Bull will be very impressed either. I'm not sure that this is a very good thing for Perez to have done in terms of his future at Red Bull, even for this year, because Helmut Marko in Austria, Red Bull's home circuit, Max Verstappen, his driver, Perez was very, very near to putting Max a little bit too far on the grass to the point where he might have had a spin. And that's not acceptable. And that's the way Marko will see it. He won't accept, any more than I would, he won't accept Perez's excuse that he didn't know he was there. Visibility was terrible. So that was the main thing. It was a good race because of those conditions, because of the nature of the circuit. Very short lap. It's designed around close racing. And Nico Hulkenberg should be the next person to get any sort of headline, because he held P2 for quite a long time and looked really good in the Haas-Ferrari. Good luck to him. Good luck to Haas as a team. I say good luck. What I mean is well done. And yes, he faded, but he was one of the first to come in for slicks, and he was the first to finish on slicks, and he finished in the points. So a really good day for Nico Hulkenberg. And on top of all that, it was a medium tyre that he chose, which was a pretty good one to have right at the end of the race, because the reds went off very quickly. And so he set fastest lap too. So how about that? Nico Hulkenberg in the Haas-Ferrari held P2 for a long time, finished sixth, and set fastest lap. Carlos Sainz drove really well in the other Ferrari. Took a while to get past Nico, but took his time and did it well, and then secured third place. It became pretty much a question of looking after the intermediates after that, using bits of wet track to keep them cool. And as I say, all the front runners stayed on their intermediates because he would have lost too much time coming into slicks. For slicks, it was only worth doing that if he was sort of midfield backwards. Nico Hulkenberg to one side, but he was dropping like a stone when he did it. So Carlos finished third, but I think the key element to Carlos Sainz's drive is how bad he made Charles Leclerc look. Leclerc was midfield, couldn't get past people like Esteban Ocon. In fact, got blown away by people like Esteban Ocon and Lando Norris. He just looked all over the place. There was one lap when he just half lost it in the middle of the last corner, and just looked to be driving a different racing car to Carlos Sainz. Part of that is that he didn't qualify as well, and he was in the murk early on, but it looked like whenever he was putting the power down, the thing was just getting away from him. Whereas when Carlos was driving it, beautifully smooth, everything more or less under control. So this was another, I said yesterday, welcome back Charles Leclerc. This was the Charles Leclerc we haven't seen all year, but starting to revise that straight away 24 hours later. And in the end, having come in for intermediates, finished only 12th. And in the end, having come in for medium compound slicks, finished only 12th. So that'll be a day when Charles Leclerc will be thinking, what is going on here? Carlos Sainz is actually doing a very, very good job. And then fourth and fifth were the two Aston Martins, Lance Stroll ahead. Now, I've been going on all year about how, well, I've used the word condescending, how condescending Alonso's been on the radio, just scoring points with the Stroll family, saying, oh, tell Lance he's doing a great job. And he usually says this when Lance is running sort of 11th and he's running third. And it's pretty easy to say things like that. But it was great today, I thought, when Lance Stroll, 2/3 of the way through the race, with Fernando behind him, as he had been from the third corner when he got him, when Fernando braked a little bit too late and ran wide. So 2/3 of the way through the race, Stroll gets on the radio and says, tell Fernando not to race too hard because it's going to slow us both down. Now that's the sort of thing a team leader says about the fast young teammate behind him. This is Lance Stroll saying that about Fernando Alonso. And you can imagine when Fernando finds out that that radio message was made, and he got beaten as well, and he was very close to Stroll right at the end. Stroll was going through the damp patches, keeping the tyres cool very well, and just protecting his bit of road, and Fernando was all over him doing this, doing that, but he beat him, and Fernando will be absolutely livid about that. He may not appear that way in the garage or the pit lane of the motorhome. The smile will be there, but I can tell you now, he will be absolutely livid. And this is the first time, I think, when Fernando will be thinking, wow, this isn't quite as easy as I thought. This isn't Fernando coming in and turning the team around and becoming the hero of Aston Martin. This is Fernando driving for the Strolls, and Lance Stroll actually did a very good job today, finished in front of me. So that was an interesting one. And don't forget, tomorrow, it's very close as well, and Stroll is ahead of him on the grid too. So that's something worth watching in the Grand Prix proper tomorrow. Nico Hulkenberg, as I say, finished sixth. And 7th and 8th, Esteban Ocon and George Russell. Esteban stayed out on intermediates, did a very good job, particularly when he was racing against Charles Leclerc, and pulled away from him in the Alpine. George Russell came in for soft compound slicks and drove through the field. George having had a disastrous shoothouse going into the sprint race when, having got through Q1, the hydraulics failed on his car and he couldn't go out anymore, and the mechanics had to do long job taking out the steering rack to get to the hydraulics and basically completely rebuild the front of the car. Did a good job. So there he is, scything his way through the field again with Lewis behind him. And they get to the last corner and he's got the run on Ocon coming out of the last corner, pulls out, and Ocon crosses the line 0.009 ahead of George Russell, 1 on intermediates, 1 on slicks. So that was an interesting comparison. Alpine just ahead of Mercedes. And Lewis Hamilton, who also had a dreadful shootout going into the sprint race, SQ1, didn't even get out of SQ1, sprint Q1, because his quickest lap, which would easily have put him in to Q2, was deleted when he ran wide coming out of 10. Lewis Hamilton. Unbelievable. So let's have a look then at all the drivers who did lose a lap. In red are the laps of the drivers that were actually quicker than any other lap they did legally, if you like. But it's interesting, the only driver in that situation who would have benefited had his lap counted was Lewis Hamilton. Logan Sargent, Nick De Vries, Yuki Tsunoda actually went quicker after those laps were deleted. But Lewis Hamilton, that 6.6 would have put him, as I say, into Q2. So that was a massive mistake by Lewis and a huge problem for Mercedes, because they've got Lewis not getting out of Q1 and then they got George Russell with an hydraulic problem. Because you would imagine that in the wet on intermediates with drivers like George and Lewis that Mercedes might have gone a lot better than they actually did. Yeah, George was pretty quick towards the end, but Lewis was... Well, you know, Lewis, when he's in a battle with guys like Magnussen and Ocon and those guys, what's he going to do? He's not going to force the issue as much as a guy in his second year in Formula One. He's going to kind of wait for one of them to make a mistake. And usually that happened and it looked great. And there was one lap when Lewis was having his battle with Kevin Magnussen and did a really nice up and under coming out of turn 3, got the inside line on acceleration. He's got the run down into the downhill right under turn 4. And he just leaves the door wide open, and Magnussen just goes straight back down the inside again. And you think, what's going on here? And admittedly, Lewis then kind of presumably shouted at himself, because he then went around the outside of Kevin going through the next long left-hander, which is a lovely bit of driving. But what was he doing leaving the door open like that? It was just a bizarre Lewis Hamilton, I thought, that we saw today. He drove pretty well from where he was on the grid, but he didn't look comfortable mixing it. And why would he, actually? Why would he look comfortable mixing it wheel to wheel with Kevin Magnussen in the wet around Austria? He must be thinking, what am I doing? And it's a disappointment, obviously, for them, for Mercedes, for Lewis, for George, for everybody, that the car isn't much better than it was this time last year. I say that because if it was a really, really well-balanced car with lots of grip, I'm not sure Lewis would have been making the sort of mistakes he has been making in the dry in qualifying. And Oscar Piastri, again, I thought drove very well in the other McLaren, almost set fastest lap. He was beaten right at the end by Nico with that time, but he finished 11th in the McLaren. Really good pass to beat Charles Leclerc on the last lap. Amazing. So Charles Leclerc, where are you, please? please regain the Charles we saw yesterday. Put him on different helmet or something. So that's it. Just a couple of final thoughts. One, where were the galoshes? Jackie Stewart always used to wear galoshes over his race boots on the grid if you're walking around and the track's wet, on the basis that your mechanic could never do a perfect job just wiping the soles dry. Galoshes were the thing. And they seem to be a perfect answer. I don't know why we don't see galoshes anymore. It's particularly this level of Formula One. I would imagine most of the drivers could afford to buy them from the local fishing shop there in Zeltweg. I'm being kind of half serious. Point 2, what are those medals they keep giving out after the sprint race? They're not up on a podium, so it's not as if the photographers have got a great shot that's going to be ruined if there's a green garland around the driver. Why not go back to the garlands? The garlands were brilliant because they differentiated the sprint from the Grand Prix, and it meant something in the history of Formula One, and they look wonderful anyway. Those things they're just holding up. I mean, Carlos had his, and he sort of didn't know how to stand, what to do with it, put it up here, around there. I mean, it's just ridiculous, I think. They had a great idea with those garlands, and they should go back to them. And then the final point Only because I've been going on about short corners for the last couple of weeks, and I've got these 2 videos out, which I'd invite you to watch if you haven't yet, explaining how Max drives. Of course, all that applies to the dry. And probably today you're very aware, as I was, of Max and other very good drivers using wide lines, looking for the grip, nothing to do with short corners at all, which is absolutely normal. The point is the ability to manage a car and to find where the grip is and to use that position on the track to your advantage, to be really quick if you're not using the racing dry line, is exactly the same ability that Max has when he's looking for his correct transition zone. It's that ability to manage the car in terms of its braking, steering input, coming out of the brake pedal, how to apply the power, all those things in those very subtle way. All of those things manifest themselves in the wet, not in short corners, but in the way he pulled away from Sergio Perez. I thought it was quite interesting how Perez locked up on the formation lap going into turn 3, a little bit as he did in Melbourne in qualifying when it was similar conditions, and then almost lost it coming out of turn 5 on the formation lap as well. Whereas Max, again, kind of looked as if he was on rails everywhere. So, yeah, it's a different thing. It's fun watching them in the wet. It's fun watching how a driver like Max uses his talent, that short corner talent, on a wet track when he's got to use a wide line looking for the grip. It's still there. It just looks different. Anyway, that's it. I should close there by passing on my sympathy and thoughts to the family and friends and to MP Motorsport, the team of Delano Vanthof, the young Dutchman who passed away today after an accident in the support race for the Spa 24 Hours at Raidillon, another multi-car accident at Raidillon. He was competing in the Formula Regional European Championship by Alpine race. Talented driver, talented Dutchman, had done well in Formula 4, won the Spanish Championship. Always terrible news to hear of things like that. So thoughts are with him, and may his memory be a blessing. Anyway, looking forward to the Grand Prix tomorrow in Austria. See you then.